Welcome to Notes to My Legal Self. Together, we explore topics of interest to in-house lawyers. We cover career, practice tips, leadership, the future of law, mental health, legal tech, and much, much more. Know someone who'd make a great guest? Let us know. Self-nominations are encouraged. They're an act of courage. Want to get the most from this conversation? Ask questions, comment, like, follow, say hello. In short, engage. Finally, have fun. In-house legal practice is a serious business, but you don't have to take yourself seriously. Let's begin. Here's your host, Olga Mack.
Oh, hello, everyone. Welcome to Notes to My Legal Self. Yes, this is an unusual time. I usually have this conversation in the morning Pacific Standard. And the reason it's unusual is because I have an amazing guest, and she does not live in another state. She's not in my zip code. She is on a different continent. And turns out I have to accommodate the sun sometimes. Not often, but sometimes I do. And I'm really excited that you've been able to join us at 4 o'clock Pacific time, a little after. And you will have an opportunity to meet Niti, who is a contributor to this book. And as a treat, it's not just going to be me, it's going to be Memme as well, who co-authored, co-edited this book with me. And the three of us will have a good time. So if you have questions, be part of the conversation. Definitely put it in the comments. So without further ado, Memme, please introduce yourself.
Thanks so much for having me, Olga. Really excited to join these conversations. You know, it's been a pleasure working with you on that book, Legal Operations in the Age of AI. You know, I've worked a lot in these spaces by the founding team of Eversort, also lectured at Harvard Law School, and excited to dive in with Niti because her chapter was a really exciting one and she has so much expertise to share.
Niti is indeed very exciting. She has a lot of depths and breadths. She speaks about D&I, which is a very important conversation. She is a former in-house lawyer. She's done a lot of wonderful things. And so, Niti, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Olga. And it's lovely to be here with you again after quite some time. I am currently a executive and careers coach and a DEI consultant as well. I still actually do a little bit of legal work on the side as a freelance in-house counsel as well. But my passion really today is working with both individuals and corporates on anything to do with coaching, gender equity, racial equity, really trying to basically foster inclusive workplaces.
I love it. And before you went on your own, unsupervised, having fun, doing important work, what were you doing before and how did you get there?
Yeah, so I was the head of an in-house legal team before at an FMCG company, and I was there for about 10 years prior to changing direction in my career. How did I get there? So I started my career in private practice, like many lawyers do, spent about 10 years working in private practice across Melbourne, Sydney, and also in London. So I was working with Allen and Overy for quite a long time, both in London and in Sydney. From there, moved in-house and spent 10 years sort of working my way up from a counsel in the team to heading that legal team. And yeah, so that's how I got to where I got to before. But I'd always had this interest in diversity, equity, inclusion work. And so even when I was in-house and heading up my team, I was quite involved in a whole lot of diversity-related initiatives and programs at my organization as well.
I love it. So let's talk about this.
Definitely. Yeah. Niti, your chapter talks about questions that legal teams should ask themselves to see whether or not they're serious about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I mean, we don't have to walk through all 10 of the questions that you outlined, though people should pick up the chapter for that. I'm curious, just at a high level, what are some things that legal leaders should think about, especially when they're introspective and thinking about their own, whether or not they're doing enough in their own teams around DEI?
Yeah, so one of the things I really like to start with is really thinking about who has ownership for DEI in the organization that you work in. depending on the maturity of the organization and also of the team, sometimes the answers you get will be very different. So in a mature organization, people will say that DEI is the responsibility of every single person, whereas in a less mature team or organization where DEI is concerned, it's likely that people might point to, say, an HR person or to a DEI manager or someone like that in the organization. And for DEI to really be effective, it really needs to be something that everyone is contributing to and everyone is thinking about, because it requires behavioral change. It requires thinking about the way you include people, the way you talk to people, the things you ask of people, and also the systems that exist within the organization. And those systems cross over teams. They're organizational-wide systems, but sometimes they're also within individual teams. And so one of the things I think legal teams should really be asking themselves is, how similar are we as a group of people? How much scope for affinity bias exists within our team? So how have we recruited the people who are in the team? And this is not just things like gender or age or even race. It's also looking at things like educational background. It's looking at other things like sexuality, like disability, the way you've been brought up. All these things are important because as we, depending on the organization that people are working in, often the demographics that organizations are supporting, particularly if you're, say, a consumer-led organization, are going to be quite diverse. And so if you want to really understand the consumers of, say, a product that you're offering, then having diversity within your own team is going to be really important to do that. And sometimes what happens, unfortunately, is we revert to our tendency to, go for people who are very similar to us. And that's not just about gender, but it could be about worldview, and educational background and things like that are very important to that.
I love it. That's very interesting. I have so many questions, and I'm I'm trying to think how to prioritize them. Let me actually ask you one question. When you walk into the room, how do you know that diversity is lacking? The reason I ask that, when I was a junior lawyer working with a very enlightened leader, he once told me that, Olga, when you walk in the room, look at people's shoe. You will discover they more or less wear the same shoe, and that's usually a very homogeneous room. If you walk into a room and everyone has different shoes, that's likely highly that was his heuristic. Now, I don't know if he said that because, I have a teeny tiny obsession with everything accessories, shoes, bags, jewelry, whatever. He definitely spoke my language when he said that. Clearly, I still remember it 20 years later. But aside from that, what is your heuristic when you walk into a room? Because sometimes it's not just a question like sort of color and gender. It's a question, as you said, background, how you were raised, and all kinds of other things. How do you sort of get, the wind test whether you are in a homogeneous room, independent of sort of colors and sort of basic things that just kind of jump out at you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's quite a complex question because visually, there's only so much I think you can pick up when it comes to diversity. And look, for me, as someone who is a woman of color, I'm very conscious of that when I walk into rooms. And so if I'm in a room which feels very Caucasian or visually Caucasian, because look, people are often mixed race and often you cannot tell exactly what their racial background is or cultural background is just by looking at someone. But if I get the sense when I walk into a room that it's quite Caucasian, then that to me feels a little bit uncomfortable in the moment. But apart from that, and I think the shoes example is a great one. I hadn't thought of that, but it makes sense, right? Because, if you think about things like wealth and educational background or socioeconomic status and things like that, you can tell a little bit about people from the things that they wear. But having said that, like, appearances can be really deceptive. And sometimes, and this is part of what we do in life, we make judgments about people based on how people look or what they're wearing. And so those judgments can often be wrong as well. And so I think it's really important to not just look at the room that you're in, but hear from the people in the room as well. Because when you start listening to people, I think that's when you really get an insight into how similar or homogenous the room is. And rooms where there is little conflict, rooms where people are nodding and saying yes to each other, not necessarily indicative of, it being homogenous, but often that is a sign, because the more diversity you have in the room, typically the more conflict you might have. And conflict is healthy, and you need debate, and you need healthy conflict and healthy debate in order to lead to innovation, to creativity, to encourage more questions to be asked and things like that. So I think that's really important. I think listening to the room is just as important as what you see.
Awesome. I really like that. And when thinking about diversifying paths, right, and then kind of thinking about things past just kind of what might be visible, something I've seen a lot of is a lot of in-house roles almost restricting in-house roles to folks who maybe have 3, 4, 5 years of big law experience. And I've seen that you see a lot of times it's folks with these kind of diverse features that are often left behind in the big law path and don't make that partnership track. And so then, you got in-house teams almost hiring from inherently less diverse pools of applicants. I'm curious on whether or not you've seen any maybe changes in kind of how folks are approaching hiring for legal teams to maybe achieve some of these diversity goals.
Yeah, I think at least from my experience working in Australia, I think that is starting to change. And I think when I started in law firms back in the early 2000s, it was very much like that. People would look at where you went to university, and then even when you were progressing on into in-house roles, people would look at, where did you go to, which law firm did you practice at, and is it a prestigious law firm? If you're in the UK, a Magic Circle law firm, or in Australia, we have a very similar concept as well. And so people would really look at that and value that quite highly. But I think over time, people are starting to recognize that actually there are a lot of different things that people can bring to teams that can add significant value. And so, for example, when I've looked at hiring in the past, I'm often looking at things like, what other experience do people bring to the table? And one thing I think is really relevant nowadays and also important is if people have had commercial experience as well. I think that's fantastic. So it's not just even, which firm did they go to or which firm didn't they go to, but also what else have they done with their life? Even when I was making the decision to move into my own business, one of the things I said to myself as a way to get myself over the line and to take the risk was, look, even if this goes wrong, at the end of the day, I've tried my hand at entrepreneurship. And to try your hand at entrepreneurship and running your own business is only going to support you when it comes to being an effective in-house legal counsel or general counsel. And so those kind of things, I think people are starting to look at more readily now than I think they did many years ago. And I think that's courtesy of the world of work also changing, and the fact that people are doing all sorts of different things. People have side hustles now. People have different interests. People are doing 2, 3 things at the same time. Gone are the days where you went to law school and then you went into a law firm, and then from a law firm you went in-house. Things are actually quite different now. People are doing all sorts of different things. And I think that's great for the industry, because I think having that diversity, even of experience in the team that you're putting together, is really, really, really beneficial.
Yeah, I find that my favorite question to ask when I interview someone is, what was their first job and when they had it? Because reality, all else equal, if you've been working since 13 at a minimum wage job, you compare to somebody who got their first job at 25, you literally have 12 years on them. And it shows, even if they did unrelated things, in the way they handle people, in the way they think through situation, how they deal with politics and all kinds of other stuff. That's actually kind of sort of my favorite question to ask, because that difference, that gap between somebody who's been working since 13 and had their first job at 27 or 30 is massive. But the question I want to ask you is around the role of general counsel, because like D&I does not have to live in legal. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it lives in actually a specific place. Sometimes it lives in other areas. I often find that general counsel, the office of general counsel, has at least some sort of role in shaping and leading this initiative. And I'm curious, as in-house leaders, what do you think is an appropriate role? How should we think of ourselves as DNI leaders? Should we think of ourselves as DNI leaders? Because DNI is, like there's a legal component. Obviously, you cannot discriminate based on various characteristics, but this is so much more. This goes into culture and so much more. And so a lawyer may or may not be the right leader for that type of initiative.
Yeah, look, I think as I said earlier, I think DEI to be really effective needs to be something that the entire organization is looking at, not just legal counsel. And like you said, we do have a particular expertise in areas like discrimination, harassment, etc., which allow us to understand the legal nuances or parameters within which some of this stuff actually sits. And I think that's really important. But I think one of the things that is pretty unique to legal counsel in organizations is that we are often involved in various different parts of the organization, and we often have a really brilliant bird's eye view into what's going on in different teams, and we have connections with different teams in the organization. And I think once you have that bird's eye view, it gives you a really nice foundation from which to foster these conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, to look at the systems that exist in the organization and actually how do these systems work and how do these operate. We're also generally, particularly if you're general counsel, in rooms talking about talent and progression, promotion of individuals in different teams in the organization. And I think, again, those rooms are really good opportunities to challenge biases, to challenge stereotypes, to really be inquisitive and curious. And so I think whilst it doesn't necessarily have to be something that a general counsel or legal counsel focuses in on, I think the unique position we have in organizations, and also the fact that many of us are advocates and advocate for things, left, right, center, allows us to step into this space in a really effective way.
No, that's excellent. Me being a data numbers guy, I do want to ask and dig a little bit deeper into how legal teams can use some of the data and the metrics that they have to measure the effectiveness of some of these DEI initiatives and drive continuous improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much data in organizations, and often we don't look at it enough in relation to the programs that we're running. I mean, one of the things I often see going wrong in organizations is that we'll have one DEI initiative and then another initiative and then another initiative, and none of them are tied together, and there's no overall strategy that brings that all together. So I think to start off, you need to have the framework. Like, why are we doing the things that we're doing? What's important about these programs that we're running? What problems are we trying to fix, or what needs are we trying to address? And then you can, from there, look at what data will support us in assessing whether or not these programs are actually working. So, for example, if you're looking at inclusive hiring practices and looking at changing the way your interview pools work or your interview panels work, then what does the hiring numbers, or what do the hiring numbers coming out the other end tell you about what's going on in those hiring practices? And you can do that even internally for internal hiring processes as well, or for progression discussions. Who's progressing, who's not progressing? Say if women are going on parental leave, what happens when they return? How long does it take them to progress to the next level, etc.? There's so much data in organizations. If we tap into that, it can give us really useful insights into actually what's working or what's not working.
So let's talk about barriers, because there is this component of compliance, obviously, when it comes to DNI issues, but it's so much more. And as I mentioned before, your legal leader may or may not be the ideal leader for DNI initiatives. And then, of course, there's sort of notions and conceptions about who lawyers are and what they bring to the table and what they do not bring to the table, all kinds of things. So you're a house leader and you want to be impacting your DNI initiatives. What barriers should you expect? Question one, and question two, what is sort of techniques and the shortcuts for addressing and kind of getting to a yes in the most streamlined way?
Yeah, so I think number one barrier I would say that exists is sometimes the willingness or buy-in from the broader organization. And so sometimes you're facing an uphill battle with some of these initiatives, and particularly if, say, the business has a lot of different commercial priorities at that point in time, or the business is going through some trouble. Things like DEI tend to be something that sort of falls away to the side because people go, well, we don't have the budget right now, or we don't have the time to focus on this right now. And I think one of the really good ways to deal with this is by ensuring that DEI strategy connects into business strategy. So why is it important that we focus on DEI in order to be able to bring our business strategy to life? I think the more closely those two things are aligned, the more likely it is that you're going to get that buy-in. And so, even before, when we were talking about, for example, consumer needs and the demographics of the people that the organization is serving, that's a really good example of something that, if you're trying to sell a product and you're in a time of strife and you really need to sell this product and you've got marketing campaigns running and all these different projects to try and up sales, then on the other hand, what does your own organization look like in terms of diversity? How well do you understand the consumers that you're trying to serve? And so the people that are creating these marketing campaigns, the people who are reviewing them from a legal perspective, what do they bring to the table in terms of understanding the needs of that demographic that you're trying to, point these marketing campaigns towards? And so I think that's one of the barriers that often we see in organizations. And I think that's a really good way of addressing that barrier. Other barriers, sometimes I think people do view lawyers as being just lawyers and that they should stay in their lane and focus on law and leave other things to other parts of the business. I've definitely had that said to me before, and I'm sure other people have in times gone by as well. And so, I think that's a real barrier. And I think there it's about, how you express that and how you share what you bring to the table and why it's valuable that you have an insight into these other areas. And so I've always said to anyone that I've ever managed or led in an organization that, you know what, like it's your whole person that makes you the leader that an organization needs, right? Yes, you might be a lawyer, but what makes you a leader in the organization? And a leader is someone who brings all these other aspects into the things that they do, the things that they say, the conversations they have, the initiatives they drive in an organization. And so I think that's where leadership becomes really important to discuss.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, an important piece of leadership is, of course, developing, talent. And I'm wondering, as general counsel, how can you support the career advancement of diverse talent that's within your legal teams or even across your organization?
Yeah, good question. And I think one of the things that we really see, and I see this even more now that I'm not in the legal field as much, is how sponsorship is something that benefits some and doesn't benefit others. And so I think that's something that from an equity perspective, organizations need to address, and we need to proactively address it. And I think in-house counsel, general counsels can really be looking to do that. And so what do I mean when I talk about sponsorship? I mean, having people who advocate for you in rooms where decisions are made, say, for example, about things like progression or promotion or talent or opportunities, which might be, secondment opportunities or international opportunities or opportunities to work on high profile projects, for example. And so really helping to sponsor other people in the organization, if you're a general counsel, I think is really important, so that you have a really deep understanding of what does this person, say, for example, in the sales team do? What do they do really well? What are their strengths and skills? What are some of the things they've achieved in their career and some of the projects that they're working on, some of the great work they're doing, so that when their name comes up in conversations around talent, around promotion, whatever it might be, you actually have all that insight that you can then bring to the table to advocate for that person, and or potentially sometimes even defend that person against things that are potentially being said against them, or about them that are negative, right? So I think that's really important. And equally for in-house counsel, I think a general counsel can really encourage their team to go and find sponsors, to build relationships with people external to their team so that they do have these advocates that sit in other parts of the organization. Because the more of these sponsors you have, the more voices you'll have supporting you in these rooms. And I think particularly for, for women, for anyone who comes from a sort of more marginalized sort of background or has diversity in the mix, I think this is really important because research shows that, for example, women tend to have far less sponsors than men do because men often build informal relationships. And also we then have things like if women go off and have kids, for example, not everyone does, but if they do, then that means they're out of the picture for a little while as well. And so that all adds to how networks are built or how networks are lost. And so I think sponsorship is really key.
Yeah, I love it when we talk about women having children. In my experience, it takes two to get there. So, and as being married to somebody who was really into children and really wanted to spend time, I find this conversation incredibly interesting. But that aside, we are coming to the end. We have maybe a couple of questions, and unfortunately, this conversation is quickly coming to its conclusion. I know, Niti, you talk a lot about this concept of curiosity and how that really kind of, it's not a full solution. It will not solve all D&I problems, but it does have sort of a role and an opportunity to make us a little bit more enlightened than where we start out by default. So I'm curious if you can share that and maybe even some of your best practices that we can implement in our daily lives as legal leaders.
Yeah, I think there's a few different things. So number one, I always say to people, assume less, ask more. And I think this is critical in all sorts of different conversations. We make so many assumptions as leaders about what other people need or want. And often that leads us down paths that don't align to what that person actually needs or wants. And I see this day in, day out all the time. And I think the more we can lean into asking questions to really understanding our people, and not just the people in our team, but the people in the organization, the more likely it is that we're going to be able to support people as and where they're at, rather than where we think they're at or what we think they need. So I think that's really key. I think too, interrogating systems is really important. Systemic bias is huge in organizations. And so often when we're doing diversity programs, it's very surface level. Like we'll have events for, say, Chinese New Year or for something else, or we might have women's leadership programs. But what are the underlying systems that exist within the organization? Things like, how does talent work? What do we look at in terms of the criteria for how someone progresses in an organization? Things like mobility. Who does that advantage or disadvantage, for example? What is our culture like? Do we have a heavy drinking culture? Like, who does that support or who does that disadvantage when it comes to building networks, getting sponsorship relationships, having those sort of informal bonds with people in the organization? So looking at the systems and the culture that we have in the organization is, I think, really important. And I think for any in-house counsel or general counsel or anyone in an organization, interrogating these things is really important. Don't just follow the system, let it be what it is. Actually ask questions of it. And I think this is where curiosity is so important. Like remembering to ask those questions is, I think, what's going to uncover some of these issues and potentially allow us to move forward beyond them.
Incredible. And before we wrap up, I was hoping you could look ahead a little bit and maybe talk to us about any emerging trends that you might be seeing in the DEI space that legal leaders might need to be aware of or should prepare for.
Yeah, look, I think one of the areas that's obviously very big at the moment and that we're still understanding, I think, more fully is neurodiversity. And I think that is something that for general counsel, even looking at their own teams, but not just teams, also the broader organization, things like the fit out of the organization, like just the building, the structure, how we operate as an organization, how we run meetings, things like that. I think neurodiversity is something that we are starting to see a lot more of, is probably the wrong set of words to use, but I think it's something that is definitely coming to light more. More and more people are getting diagnosed with different sorts of neurodiversity, and there is a range of neurodiversity out there as well. And so I think this is an area that for general counsel, I think is really important to understand. I think the other thing that is evolving and continues to evolve is just how we look at sexual harassment and harassment more broadly in organizations. And I know in Australia, one of the things that we've moved towards is far more proactive obligations on employers to really try and prevent those things from happening, not just reacting to them as and when they've happened. And so I think that's going to be really important. How do you build systems, structures, organizations that actually prevent these things from happening in the first place, versus what we've typically done in the past, which is very much reacted in the moment, run compliance investigations, interrogated people or asked questions, found out what's happened, and then, employed whatever measures afterwards. I think that's a really big shift that we're seeing in organizations and in, legislation. And so that is something I think that's going to be really key to address, because we're going to have to do more in this space, particularly from a legal standpoint, than we ever have done before.
I know neurodiversity is sort of a term that is in vogue, but not everyone is familiar with it. So maybe, Niti, you can explain to folks what that means. And practically speaking, as you navigate somewhat complex hiring process of neurodiverse individuals, what are sort of best practices? It is definitely an evolving field, and I'm personally not very well educated about it, and would love to hear a fuller definition and answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So neurodiversity, as it sounds, is about how our brain works and the different types of diversity that exists in the way our brain actually is set up and to work. And so things like ADHD are part of neurodiversity. I've got a daughter myself who's got sensory processing issues. That's a form of neurodiversity. So there are all these different types of neurodiversity that exist. And for different people, that can mean, for example, that loud noises can be problematic for certain people. For other people, light can be a problem. And so when you think about the way workplaces have shifted the way they work or the way they fit out their buildings, often we have moved towards these very open plan sort of environments. And that can be quite problematic for some people who have particular forms of neurodiversity, where things like sound and light can be a little bit more challenging for them. And so this is where, even when we had the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion around how working from home can sometimes support those who do have different forms of neurodiversity, but it can show up in all sorts of different ways. Some people who have different neurodiversity find it difficult to understand things like emotion and so empathy and things like that can be slightly different for certain people. And so it manifests and presents in so many different ways, because if you think about how your brain works, people's brain work in all different kinds of ways. And I think this is an evolving field. It's something we are just starting to really understand in a little bit more depth. And I think it's something that we're just going to have to keep working on, because as we think about creating safe workplaces for people, so even, our obligations under things like occupational health and safety legislation, we're going to have to think about this in the context of people who have neurodiversity. But in terms of what can we do when we're hiring people who have neurodiversity in the mix, I think it's really asking people what they need and how best you can support them. And I think that is the easiest thing to do, is to just let them tell you what they need, because people will share that with you. I mean, I've facilitated events before where I've had people in the audience, who are neurodiverse and who have a list of things that they need facilitators to do, right? So it's kind of things like maybe don't have large group discussions where everyone's talking at the same time, because that can be quite challenging for people. So I think understanding from people what they need is really important, so you can modify the way you're working or the way meetings are run, the sorts of environments you're putting that person into.
Well, the three of us can talk for a long time because we clearly don't like to talk. And this has been a great conversation. Meme, thank you so much for helping to edit this book. I thoroughly enjoyed working with you, and thank you so much for joining for this conversation. Niti, thank you so much. I always find our conversation around all kinds of things from leadership to D&I incredibly insightful. And among the three of us, Mimi and myself and you, we've covered a lot of ground. You've shared a lot of great tips and shortcuts and things to think about. What is one thing, if folks remember nothing else, what is the one thing you hope that they get away from this conversation?
I think the one thing I would like people to take away is my catchphrase, which is assume less, ask more. And I think if people can do that more with anyone they're leading, with the organization that they're in, with the systems within that organization, I think that will go a long way to supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion within those workplaces.
I love it. And Meme, what is your takeaway? What is one thing that you're taking away? I know you took away a lot of things, but what is one thing that you took away from this conversation that you hope others as well?
Yeah, most definitely. I'd say my one takeaway is that, in particular, legal leaders have a lot they can be doing, one within their own teams, but then also throughout the whole organization in this space, and neither should be neglected.
I love it. Thank you so much, both. It's been an incredible conversation. I'm so glad we've been able to have this conversation and accommodated the sun. So thank you both so much. And thank you, audience, for joining. And thank you for being part of this conversation. I will absolutely see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for stopping by. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Notes to My Legal Self. Know someone who'd make a great guest? Let us know. Self-nominations are encouraged. They are an act of courage. Remember, the future of law is bright. Enjoy your in-house practice. It's an adventure of a lifetime. See you soon.